The first step in the soul of the role process is to define the role. We'll walk you through how to do it in these next 2 videos. The first video is going to focus on the questions you'll answer about your direct report's role. The second video will give you instructions for how to share that process with them and to ask them to draft their responses. You'll find a series of worksheets for the soul of the role in your workbook. The reason we're having you go through these questions before you introduce the concept of soul of the role with your direct report is we want you to have some time and space to reflect and prepare for the conversation so you feel confident going in. To get started, choose a direct report that you'd like to develop deeper alignment with. Think about their role on your team and in the organization. You're going to answer 4 questions designed to help you reflect on the purpose of their role, what success looks like in that role, the key objectives for the next 90 days, and the decision-making rights that you think this role should have. As you go through that first worksheet, you'll be asked to reflect on how you see your direct report's role. Remember, we're talking about the role itself, not the person who's in that role today. Let's look at the first question. What is the purpose of this role? Remember, it's not about what the tasks are, not about what the things that are in their inbox, not about what the deadlines that you're worried about, but really think about why this role is important to the team and to the organization overall. Why does this role exist? Okay, let's take a look at the second question. Once you've identified the purpose of the role, now think about the skills and the characteristics and the behaviors that are needed for someone to be successful in this role. Anyone, not just the person who's in that role today. Do they need to be able to communicate proactively? Do they need to build high trust by being more responsive and consistent? What's unique to this role that's different than the other roles? Next, let's talk about objectives. What you're looking for are 3 priorities that are meaty enough, that are important enough for this person to be thinking about every single day over the next 90 days that are connected to the overall purpose. So pinpoint these 3 objectives for the next 90 days and write them down. If you have a few more, that's natural, that's understandable. You're going to refine those with your direct reports to bring it down to that core set of 3. The last question is about the decision-making rights for this role, both for you and for your direct report. One of the most challenging things for people to understand is where their role ends and someone else's begins. One way to think about it is, what do they get to do on their own? What decisions can they make, should they make, do you want them to make without input from you? On the contrary, what decisions should they make and do they make on a day-to-day basis where they should need input from you, where they should be coming to you before they put some action into the world? If you're struggling with your answers to these questions, don't worry. Most people struggle to answer these seemingly simple questions because it's a topic that's been hidden under the surface of your team for quite a long time. You might feel like it's not the right time, that you're not ready to have this conversation because your team or your organization is in flux. Don't fall into that trap. You might not be able to make it all the way through the process, but you can still answer some of the questions, do some of the reflections, and help that person feel more aligned to what they're working on, even if what they're aligned to is an organization or a team that's going through a change. In the next video, you're going to take some time to introduce your direct report to the concept of alignment and the soul of the role. Throughout this course, you've heard me use the words content and context often. Let's talk about what we mean by that. You could think simply that content is what is happening, and context is why does it matter. Another way to think about content and context is content are the things that are obvious, the content in your inbox, the content of a meeting, the things that are on the agenda, whereas the context are the things that happen in the background or underneath the surface. It's the context or those more nuanced things that have such an outsized impact on company culture, team engagement, and things like retention and attrition that we often miss because we're so focused on the tasks and the projects and the things that we can see. Let's start with an example to illustrate what we mean by the soul of the role and the impact that it can have both on you as a manager and also on your direct report. Brandon was managing Morgan, and they were on a tight deadline for a project to ship to a really important client. And so what happened, which happens all the time, is it was last minute and the product needed to be shipped, and Brandon felt like he had to intervene and take over the project and ship it. And while that may have been necessary in the moment, what happened is a kind of mini tragedy because Morgan was deprived of the growth opportunity. The conversation didn't happen, it got skipped as to why those deadlines are important and why it matters and how it's essential to the role and how to connect deadlines and the business realities to the creative work itself. So the soul of the role conversation, if it had happened, would have highlighted a gap for Morgan. Oh, I'm really focused on the work itself, and I really just think about the creative process. And I hadn't really made the connection to why my role is also really about the delivery and why that's just as important. And I see now why that matters. So when you skip or you miss or you don't realize the importance of finding that soul of the role, that will tend to happen over and over and over again. Let's talk about another manager who was struggling without realizing it. Tanya is a CEO that we worked with. She runs a software business that's going through a period of dynamic growth. And she has a CTO, or Chief Technology Officer, who's responsible for basically half of the organization and most of the people that are working on product innovation and moving the company forward. And one of the concerns that she came to us with is she felt like she had to do too much of the work relative to intervening and seeing around the corner and thinking specifically about, are we doing the right things relative to staying competitive in the market? And when her coach started asking her about this and started probing about, well, what is the soul of the role? Isn't that what the CTO should be doing? Isn't that what your Chief Technology Officer should be focusing on? She realized that she had never had that conversation, and she had just been operating day to day thinking that it was her job. She hadn't done that foundational work to think about, well, what do I really need the CTO, whoever that person is going to be, what do I need them to own? What do I need them to think about? What do I need them to worry about? And that's the gap that we often miss as leaders and managers. The soul of the role is the heart of that process, and where you have these conversations to pull out those things and those elements that currently live within you. They're in your mind. They're the things you cycle about. They're the things that cause you frustration and concern. So you can see in both of these examples the conversation that got missed. In the case of Brandon and Morgan, it was more about the content and a lack of understanding about who was responsible for what in a more operational way. In the example with Tanya and her CTO, it was more about a strategic gap and who was responsible for innovation and disruption that they needed to have the conversation about.